reinterpret what we have been doing till now, right? And I was telling Aram already that thinking of wider implications of the war, which I will not count because this is so many, for me as well. When a couple of days ago, I heard of Azerbaijani bombing in Armenia proper, and this changes everything, right? This is no longer about contested territories. This is about, again, violating previously accepted territorial borders of Armenia. Having grown myself in a war-torn society, this hurts over and over again. And it is important that we voice it here now that we will also be talking of knowledge production, because at least, and if I may say, as an individual and as a researcher, what we hear in media about this conflict is very limited. I would even recommend some of the regional media to be looked at. One of those is Aussie media, so that we get informed better, because about this, there is really very little knowledge around. Now we will slowly come back to the other war and open this panel, for which I'm so grateful that the three of you are here. And we have these. I don't know if we should have it in front of us, but we have these three amazing speakers today: Volodymyr Ishchenko, Agnes Kaji, and Tim Liebert, to reflect on the questions that I opened with, right? How the war has been changing knowledge production and what it has been doing to our research. I would be able to talk a lot, but I don't want to. I want to directly give the voice to you, to the three of you, to elaborate on these topics. First, I will ask Volodymyr. May I introduce you for a little bit? And then I'll ask you to intervene immediately. So Volodymyr is a research associate at the Institute of East European Studies at Free University of Berlin. His research focuses on protest and social movements, revolutions, radicalization, right and left politics. He is very widely published in academic, but also in media platforms. And he's currently working on collective monograph on the Maidan uprising, mobilization, radicalization, revolution in Ukraine, 2013-14. We hear you now.
Thank you so much.
Why don't you take this?
Thank you. Thank you, Leila, for convening this panel and for inviting me and letting me speak about the things that I could share with you. And addressing the question of the panel of how the war affects the knowledge production, I'd like to share my reflections on how the Ukrainian social scientists have been incorporating into the international debates, discussions, panels with the start of the invasion and with the, I believe, a basic dilemma which we are meeting right now. Either we are expanding the Western identity politics with Ukrainian topics, or we are actually trying to contribute to the universal human knowledge, using Ukraine and our knowledge about Ukraine to answer the questions of much global relevance and important for different contexts. So I'll start from the discussion about decolonization of Ukraine, which is increasingly raised by the scholars of the regions, by the Ukrainian intellectuals, and not only Ukrainian, also in the West. And in like within the Ukraine, the decolonization particularly means the eradication of the Russian culture and language from Ukrainian public sphere and education. And for some other people, it means also at the ultimate end, the dissolution of the Russian Federation into multiple smaller states, basically to finish the process that started with the Russian Empire collapse in 1917, and then with the Soviet Union collapse in 1991. And so now there's something to finish with that. But in the context of social sciences, of course, it's should mean the decolonizing the knowledge about Ukraine, about Russia, and about the whole region, which is perceived as an object of a very long-term Russian imperialism. However, when the biggest wave of decolonization happened in the human history after the Second World War, the focus of decolonization was quite different. At that time, it meant not just the disintegration of the European colonial empires, but crucially, the developmental states for the post-colonial countries, based on a robust public sector, nationalization, and overcoming the disbalances of the colonial economy via the import substitution. And the contradictions and failures of such strategies were analyzed by the various Marxist or Marxism-inspired theories of imperialism, neo-imperialism, dependency, world system analysis. However, now, decolonization comes to Ukraine and Russia in the context of neoliberalism, taking the place of state developmentalist policies and theories. National liberation is not understood anymore as inextricably linked to a social revolution that would challenge the basis of capitalism and imperialism. And instead, it happens in the context of our post-Soviet so-called Maidan deficient revolutions, which usually swap one fraction of the ruling class for another fraction of the same class. And materialist and class-based dependency theories or theories of imperialism are no longer as popular as post-structuralist post-colonial studies. And therefore, it is not surprising that Ukraine's decolonization is so much about identity and symbols and so little about political economic transformation. Ukraine's decolonization does not lead to a more robust state interventionist economic policies, but almost precisely to the opposite, which is, you could think, which is particularly amazing during the time of the war, when typically the states conduct strategic nationalizations, price controls, increase taxes, because they need more money for the war to defend the country. Instead, Ukrainian government goes with privatization. It lowers taxes, it liberalizes labor legislation to the extreme. It prioritizes the transparent, so-called transparent international businesses instead of the so-called corrupt domestic businesses. Ukraine does not develop a sovereign state in an economic sense, but it basically tries to sell the state to the foreign investors like a startup, or at least what the Ukrainian ministers were doing in Lugano in July at the Ukraine Recovery Conference. That look like very much like this. This part of Ukraine could be interested for France, this part of Ukraine could be interested for Germany, this for Canada, and so on and so forth. And Ukrainian decolonization is reduced in this way to basically getting rid of anything related to Russian control over Ukraine in topography, culture, education, in the public sphere in general. And instead, it amplifies the voices articulating Ukrainian distinctiveness. And this is combined also with attacks or even repression of the voices who oppose this process, or are simply labeled, usually, frankly speaking, misleadingly, as pro-Russian. In this way, Ukraine's decolonization becomes a version of identity politics. The politics centered around the affirmation of belonging to a particular essentialized group with a projected shared experience. Now, thanks to the increased global interest to Ukraine, but also to the, unfortunately, to the physical relocation of the millions of Ukrainians to the Western countries who enter more actively the international academia, media, and public discussions, the Ukrainian scholars, intellectuals, artists meet a dilemma. Either we are incorporating ourselves as just another voice in a specific field of the institutionalized identity politics in the West, in which Ukrainians would be just the most recent addition in a very long queue of the myriad of other minority voices, or instead, starting from the tragedy of Ukraine, we can articulate the questions of the global relevance, search for the solutions, and contribute to universal human knowledge. And paradoxically, the second scenario would require a much deeper and more genuine engagement with Ukraine than it happens now. So the problems of identity politics, the critics of contemporary identity politics point to its fundamental contradiction. Why do we look for recognition from the very institutions we reject as oppressive? Originally, identity politics was born in the Black Power and second wave feminist movements, in the context of the new left of the 1960s, 1970s. And it was inextricably linked to the struggle to overcome capitalism and imperialism in general. They were understood as standing behind the oppression of the women and people of color. However, now the question of the universal emancipation of the humankind got lost, and contemporary identity politics amplifies the particular voices that require representation simply based on their particularity. Instead of the social redistribution, we call now primarily for recognition only within the institutions that are not put into question. And moreover, because the groups that identity politics tends to essentialize, they are always internally diverse, it inevitably amplifies the more privileged voices who are legitimated to speak on behalf of the oppressed group that they do not really represent. And this is why in quite many progressive movements, the white middle class people from the global north tend to dominate the agenda and are supposed to speak on behalf of the people who are mostly poor, coming from the global south, and who are people of color, and who have quite many distinct problems than their supposed representatives. So in this way, contemporary identity politics reproduces and even legitimates social inequality. And obviously, Ukrainian identity politics now does not seek recognition from Russia. And at this moment, even the idea of talking to Russia is constantly under attack. Instead, Ukrainian identity politics targets primarily the West, who is seen as culpable for the Russian invasion, for trading with Russia, appeasing Putin's regime, providing insufficient support for Ukraine, and reproducing the Russian imperialist narratives about Eastern Europe. But even if the West is guilty for Ukraine's suffering, it could relatively easily redeem itself by providing unconditional support for Ukraine and unconditional rejection of the Russia or Russian. For Ukrainian identity politics, the problem is Russian imperialism, but not imperialism in general. Ukraine's dependency on the West tends to be not problematized at all. And Ukrainians should be accepted as an organic and indispensable part of the so-called civilized world. Putin's regime, in this perspective, is an ultimate evil to the West. And the West itself is increasingly articulated in civilizational terms, which helps to deal with the apparent inconsistent application of the existing substantive political distinction with Russia, China, however, which are very selectively applied. And Ukrainians, in this perspective, turn not just the same as Westerners, but even better than Westerners, because Ukrainians are defending the frontier of the Western civilization. They die and suffer for the Western values. And in this way, Ukrainians turn into more Westerners than the people who actually live in the West. However, if Ukrainians are valued primarily for being on the front line of the war with Russia, what could be Ukraine's positive contribution to the humanity beyond being more consistently anti-Russian? Is it only about integrating to and calling for recognition within the same unchallenged Western structures, trying to be more of the same, different only in terms of the quantity, not quality? Can we instead propose to the world anything fundamentally better? And how much time do I have?
I didn't count.
Sorry, because I can go like okay, yeah. Sure. Okay, yeah, but I'll try to be brief to also to let Agi and Tim speak. And some are claiming, for example, that Russian invasion is making Ukraine more democratic. You could find actually such headlines in the very respectable media in the West. But this would be an outstandingly unique case of democratizing during the war, if only it was true. There is some survey evidence in support for the rallying for democracy for the West within Ukraine, but there is no less extensive survey evidence in support for repression of dissent, which is kind of like typical and expected during the war. Ukrainian volunteers were cherished as much as now as in 2014 when the war in Donbass started. But it has proven to be just a temporary mobilization that fell down the next year and was not institutionalized. Ukrainian civil society, again, so much cherished, did have a strong, even too strong influence on the state, but it remained narrow, organized in not more than 20% of the population. And now Ukrainians respond with the burst of mutual help, of horizontal cooperation, probably like any society would respond under the existential threat. And whether and how it will institutionalize after the war is a big question, and it also depends on the difficult to predict outcomes of the war. What happens in the background of Ukrainian politics is also ban of the opposition parties. It's also unifying the media field. It's also the weak state institutions. And this is exactly the reason why volunteerism is so much needed and so much essential now. But at the same time, it's also typically unpunished vigilantism. It's also witch hunting of the voices dissenting from the patriotic consensus. So are we really in a position to teach the West democracy and civil activism? Or should the West learn from our state institutions and economy? Now, there are many stories, for example, how Ukrainian refugees who are starting to settle their lives in EU are dissatisfied with the old-fashioned and slow paper bureaucracy, especially in Germany, and with a poor service. But what stands behind the Ukrainian better service sphere are the lowest wages in Europe and the poor protection of labor rights. And even somewhat advanced, Ukraine's digitalization is typical temporary laggards advantage. Ukraine was forced to digitalize because the state institutions were becoming inefficient and corrupt. And this is about it. And this is not why the Western elite cares so much about Ukraine. Identity politics was originally a response to the starting hegemony crisis of the Western ruling classes, which they have talked about since the 1970s. And sometimes they talked about it as crisis of political representation, crisis of legitimacy. The Western elites have been less capable of claiming the political, intellectual, and moral leadership for the subaltern classes, the symptoms of which have been declining rates of participation in the institutionalized politics, the rise of the populist movements, new parties, political violence. And the rise of identity politics is another response to the same crisis. You, man, white, cisgender, heterosexual, and so on, cannot speak for us. You do not represent us. And now the Ukrainian resistance serves as a deficient solution to the Western hegemony crisis, giving more credibility to Western superiority. Ukrainians are presented as fighting and dying for what to many Westerners do not believe anymore. Shame on the decadent West. The Western elites discovered in Ukraine their new Cuba and Vietnam for their own, in order to discredit the legacy of the anti-imperialist challenge of the original Cuba and Vietnam. And the noble fight in Ukraine brings back to life the aging, inefficient, exploitative institutions and leaders with identitarian civilizational rhetoric. And so the question for Ukrainian social scientists is whether we actually would like to be a part of it. There is a huge surge of different events, panels, and sessions related to Ukraine, Russia, and the war, as well as a huge demand on the Ukrainian voices in these discussions. And certainly we cannot discuss Ukraine without Ukrainian academics, artists, and intellectuals. However, as it happened with other versions of contemporary identity politics, this leads to so-called tokenism, when a symbolic inclusion of Ukrainian voices does not mean reconsidering the structures of knowledge aligned with Western elite interests, if only the guilt is not just appeasement of Russian imperialism. Furthermore, the Ukrainian voices are needed to legitimize the quite outdated theories and arguments. Finally, as is typical for contemporary identity politics, this formalistic representation of the tokenized Ukrainian voices helps to silence other Ukrainians and their voices and repress Ukraine's diversity. For example, one of the numerous Ukrainian voices panels in the last half of the year, all three speakers are graduates of a small elite university in Kyiv. All three are Ukrainian speaking from that this is their mother tongue. Although the language situation in Ukraine is quite diverse, as you probably many of you know. Two of the three come from exactly the same region in Western Ukraine. All three know each other for 10, 15 years. So how much of the 40 million nation do these Ukrainian voices represent? Is it simply just one Ukrainian voice instead of voices? And typically, Ukrainian voices tend to come from the more privileged groups, more resourceful, better English speaking, and better connected to the West in general. And so finally, how could we actually start from Ukraine in a better way and use the knowledge about Ukraine for actually contributing something more than another voice? For example, a superior knowledge of Ukraine, of post-Soviet and East European regions in general, could be especially helpful in our search for the analysis and for the solutions to the escalating and accumulating crisis on the political, economic, and also environmental level, precisely because some of the most detrimental consequences of this crisis manifested in our parts of the world, in the post-Soviet region, and also particularly in Ukraine, perhaps in the sharpest and in the most tragic forms. So, for example, how can we discuss the contemporary revolutions that are breaking out around the globe at the accelerating speed without Ukraine, without the country where 3 revolutions happened just during the life of 1 generation? However, without bringing hardly any revolutionary change. Ukrainian Maidan revolutions embodied the contradictions in limitations of the poorly organized mobilizations with vague goals, with weak leadership in the sharpest forms. And these are the same problems that the populist responses to the Western crisis of political representation typically share. The populist leaders and parties come to power on the high expectations of change and rejection of the elites, but typically fail even starting any major reform. Nowadays, there is a high concern about the illiberal leaders like Donald Trump or Viktor Orban, and the rise of the so-called political capitalist alternative to the Western liberal capitalism in China and in some other fast-growing global South countries. Which, however, do not articulate any substantial ideological alternative. But for decades, Ukraine was dominated by extremely cynical politics of the rivaling oligarchs with the sometimes record low level of trust in the government in Ukraine. And that expectedly led to the total rejection in the staggering 73% vote for a TV star who was at that moment a complete novice in politics. Does it sound actually familiar and actually very much relevant to some of the other countries, including in the West? Or the political polarization between Ukraine's East and West, doesn't it sound very much relevant to the concerns about the growing polarization in the United States or in the post-Brexit Britain, or deindustrialization, underfunding of the healthcare and education, which was like the fundamental processes happening in all post-Soviet countries? And these are just some of the topics that allow a more productive globalizing of the discussion about Ukraine. Does it make us vulnerable to the charges in a kind of like Ukraine explaining some ungrounded stretching of the region-specific frameworks to the context which they fit only poorly? However, let's recall it, during the formative years of the classical social sciences, very specific countries served as the paradigmatic cases to explore the fundamental generic process. So we analyzed the capitalist emergence primarily based on England. France was taken as a paradigmatic case for the development of social revolutions. We own the concepts of thermidor, of Bonapartism, to very specific French political processes. Italy gave us the concepts of fascism, of passive revolution. And all these concepts were productively applied to other contexts. Of course, with some changes, of course, it should be made much more careful. But those were the paradigmatic cases for the period of capitalist progressive expansion and modernization. However, if now the world is experiencing an escalating crisis when no way out is on the horizon, shouldn't we look for the paradigmatic cases in other parts of the world? And wouldn't it be a more thorough decolonization of our knowledge? For example, let's look at the country that from the agrarian European periphery, which Ukraine was about 100 years ago, jumped to the cutting edge of space exploration, of the rocket and aviation construction, to the cybernetics, in the life of just 2 generations, and then in the life of just 1 generation, it turned into a kind of like a northernmost country of the global South, with the sharpest decline of GDP perhaps in the whole world, and with the devastating war. The country that flew to the stars and then nowadays might be bombed into the Middle Ages. 30 years ago, we were believing that Ukraine and other post-Soviet countries would be catching up with the Western Europe, and Ukraine would be like Finland or France. Only a few years later, we tempered our ambitions and we were thinking about how to catch up at least with Poland and Hungary. But now, doesn't it look like that it's rather the West which is catching up with catastrophic destruction of the post-Soviet countries? And unfortunately, we could be your future and not the other way around. And this future is dark ahead. And the problem is, of course, probably the biggest problem that just to cut it, the long story short, that even if this perspective finds sympathies among quite many Ukrainians, it's just becoming more and more difficult to voice it in Ukraine itself, when the part of the society feels like squeezed between Putin's nation-building project, or so-called one people, and the dominant Ukrainian nation-building project. And the voices which perhaps could contribute the most to the globalizing discussion of Ukraine are ironically silenced and eradicated under the narrow decolonization agenda, which is reduced to the identity politics, and which instead should be much more radical, universal, and global. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm sure that further panelists have what to reflect on this. I was even thinking to later maybe give you the space to also ask each other questions, if you like, after the first 2 rounds of questions. But now I will immediately come to you, Agi, because I know that you might continue on similar lines of looking at what kind of knowledge production is being squeezed and lost these months. Let me just very briefly introduce you, if that's fine. Agi is a researcher at Gothenburg University and a founding member of the Solidarity Economy Center in Budapest. She's a sociologist looking at Eastern European politics and social movements from the perspective of the region's long-term world economic integration.
Thank you. So just as a disclaimer, I am not qualified to speak directly about the Ukraine war. I don't do research on the topic, just take me as a random pick from the audience, which Lela told me how to take myself. But as such, what I see in terms of how knowledge production is being transformed from where I'm standing and from what is important for me, I can share some things. So actually, together with Lela and Vladimir and many others, I am part of this generation of East European scholars who really made a collective effort to bring up and start an analysis of post-socialist transformation from the perspective of the global integration of the region. And this wasn't just a disembodied scholarly interest for critical analysis. This was also part of our political motivation, asking how to conceptualize emancipative projects from the left in a post-socialist situation, how to reconsider the state socialism past and its heritage in the context of capitalist integration in the neoliberal phase of the contemporary global cycle. And also just to get back to what Vladimir was saying about trying to produce knowledge from Ukraine as if you would be a relevant contributor to global knowledge about our condition. This was also very much part of our motivation as the region was reduced to this, tertiary example of just someone trying to catch up with what we already know is the proper model of a social organization that is embodied in the West. We were really trying to understand our own societies as part of a broader global process, not because we were trying to gain some self-importance, like Ukraine's planning, like trying to get to the fore in a global competition in which you are sidelined anyway, but from this more deep understanding of, the emancipative effort to gain the capacity to conceptualize yourself as part of the human history, which is, on the epistemic level, one of the traditional efforts of the colonial tradition that Vladimir was also referring to. And in this effort, for us, what was really the most fruitful and inspiring were discussions with each other, and also discussions with Global South partners, because of the mere fact of our structural conditions and the tensions coming from them being so similar, and the indigenous efforts for conceptualizing them being able to converse with each other so easily. But at the same time, we were part of this generic East-West hierarchies that were reinstated from the 90s on, and which also happened in terms of knowledge production, the domination of Western funding, knowledge infrastructure, but that also in terms of the conceptualizations in these infrastructures that basically follow from the priorities of Western debates. And then, you know, if you actually want to do, say, a PhD on a decent quality in a decent place, you have to start by addressing those priorities and sell whatever you have to those kind of audiences. So when we were trying to research things like the social effects of European integration as neoliberalization, the political economy of deindustrialization, and then reindustrialization on lower levels of the value chain, concepts like democratization as coupled with the economic subordination, concepts like civil society or anti-corruption in the regional waves of protests that happened after 2008, which in our various countries we identified as having primarily regressive political content. When we tried to speak about these things in these knowledge infrastructures dominated by the Western concepts, then, you know, most of the time we lose by doing the disclaimers, by trying to explain why you look at these things in a different way and how you would reconceptualize them. And it's completely different from the situation that we have when we speak to each other, when we already did this work of reconceptualization, and then we can just continue doing the analysis. So in terms of this kind of work or upstream effort, what has been happening with the sharpening of the geopolitical tensions, both in terms of the US-China great power competition and its conceptualization from the US side as a conflict between democracy and authoritarianism. Of course, this is a concept binary in which Eastern Europe is automatically placed in the ways that we know, or it's the regional tensions that are primarily with Russia. The effect of these tensions was that this upstream struggle became much harder, and then Russia's war on Ukraine had, I would say, a devastating effect on not only the external conditions of our efforts, but even within our networks, within our own relationships to each other. And this is a process that probably you also experienced, that on the one hand, there is a very strong reification of the geopolitical concepts because of the war. So for people who have been doing on various aspects of the complexities of the social processes in Eastern Europe, the level of discussion you have to address now is about what does Russia want? Why Hungary chooses Russia instead of Europe and stuff like that. And this is coupled with this immense moral prerogative and also the honest moral reaction of people to just seeing people being bombed. And when the two are coupled, this urgency of the moral reaction is completely mapped over this geopolitical reification, which basically has this effect of muting the type of analysis that we were trying to do, not only in terms of its, lengthening the disclaimer phase of trying to speak about it, but also in terms of moral and political term. I mean, you really have to spend time trying to legitimate why you are trying to look at these things, and even then it might not be allowed. So I would stop at this negative moment, and if there is a second round, I could try to bring in some more positive aspects.
if I may, I will also introduce you just very briefly, Tim. Tim is a researcher at the Department of Regional Geography at Leibniz Institute of Regional Geography, of which you've heard already, and you're seeing us around. So our very immediate colleague, and he in general focuses on, he's a population geographer working on regional development, migration and mobility, with a specific focus on rural areas and small and medium-sized towns in Germany and Eastern Europe. But he has also in past years been involved in a lot of migration, or quite a few migration-related projects that already brought him to the Ukraine out-migration story. And I will immediately then just give you the voice to elaborate.
Yeah, thank you very much, Leila. I guess I also need a disclaimer because I suppose my views and my background is very different from the views and background of my fellow panelists. So first of all, I guess I need to tell the audience that I have a very much Western background. I grew up in the 70s and 80s and 90s in Southern Germany. So my interest on Central and Eastern Europe basically began when I started working at IFL. And also the kind of knowledge production I will talk about is basically, I would say, pragmatic, practical, project related, and to make things worse, I would actually say that thinking about the panel actually forced me to think about knowledge production in the framework of the project I want to talk about, which was the EU-funded project on migration of non-EU citizens to Central and Eastern European rural regions. The project was called Arrival Regions, and our goal was very ambitious. We wanted to turn migration of non-EU citizens to Central Europe into a success story. I guess if you're familiar with projects like this, with Interact projects, you will know that it's working together with local administrations, that it's working together with people. So the whole approach is very different. It's not about or let's say theorizing comes at the end of the project after the last reports have been published and the last money has come by, and I guess that's what we're going to do in the next few months. But the knowledge we have produced during the project is, I guess, also knowledge on migration, on migrants, on civil societies, political actors' reaction to migration from a very, very hands-on perspective and a very, very direct perspective. So actually, the initial idea of our project, and I guess like hearing Volodymyr and Agnes talking about their insight made me realize that I guess our project also has kind of a colonialist approach in a way. So the basic idea was we saw that many rural regions across Central and Eastern Europe have very difficult demographic situation. They are affected by outmigration, they are affected by aging, by shrinkage. Especially in Germany. So for instance, if you look at the case of Saxony-Anhalt, which is, I guess, one of the demographically worst affected states in the country, and you look at the working age population, 40% of the working age population is 50 plus. So you can see there is a big challenge coming ahead. And our initial idea was like looking at the so-called refugee crisis of 2015, why not turn this situation into a win-win situation? For the first time in recent history, a large share of refugees arrived to rural areas, not voluntarily, but in that sense, we wanted to create structures to establish a win-win situation in which, on the one hand, rural societies and rural economies will profit from this sudden and unexpected in-migration, and on the other hand, also that migrants themselves become better integrated and can start a good life in these rural areas. In research terms, we noticed that there is a strong urban focus on migration research and that rural areas are rarely in the spotlight of researchers. So again, pointing towards knowledge production, we found out that it's very difficult to transfer the knowledge strategy and concepts from urban to rural places. And we actually have worked with labor migrants from Ukraine in our Polish and Czech partner regions, and with two very different demographics. So in the Polish regions, the Ukrainians were mostly female. In the Czech region, the Ukrainians were mostly male workers in the automotive industry, which pointed to some kind of cascade. Like the Polish and Czech colleagues told us, the Ukrainian Eastern European workers, there were also some Georgians, some Belarusians, basically replaced the people who have moved on to work in Germany or in the UK or in other parts of Western Europe. I guess it's interesting to notice that if we think about this cascade, that our Croatian partner region actually has received in recent years a large number of Nepalese migrants to work in specific industries. So what our goal and our aim was, like I said, was to improve the conditions for integration. And we did so by means of pilot initiatives, which were designed by our partners, by our local partners. And they very much focused, I guess I don't want to take too much time to talk about what we have actually done, but they focused very much on the one hand on language courses tailor-made for work migrants, and on the other hand on the development of lesson plans and teaching materials to promote multicultural societies in Poland. And we also had legal counseling for work migrants, which was, I guess, very important because it was already mentioned that many workers are not aware of their rights and that many work in very exploitive conditions. Our project finished on March 31st this year. So we actually got a big deal of interest also from European institutions because our approach was to create good conditions for migrants and for integration. And it was deemed very timely that basically the work we had done during the lifetime of the project has led to at least developing strategies and infrastructures that could also deal with the influx of war refugees from Ukraine. In a more broader sense, I would say that the refugee crisis of 2015 has in very many ways paved the way towards a relatively smooth arrival of Ukrainian refugees because networks, infrastructures, and procedures are still there or could be reactivated. What is, I guess, quite interesting is to see the view on Ukrainian refugees. And I found a nice, or maybe not so nice, little quote from a report published by the University of Luxembourg, and they have a intermediate headline which reads "A stock of human capital to maintain and mobilize." So I guess that also sheds a light on maybe why Ukrainian war refugees are more welcome than refugees from other regions. But on the other hand, I would say it also sheds light that our dominant concepts of integration are actually ill-suited for Ukrainian refugees, especially in terms of a lack of flexibility for temporary migrants and the idea what migration actually should look like. And to finish with a few aspects that I guess I would say I learned myself during the project and thinking about migration from Ukraine after the war started. the hierarchy of migrants was, I guess, very widely discussed, especially in German media. But I also had a feeling that talking to our project partners in a rural region in Saxony-Anhalt and how they perceived how their work has changed. It was also interesting to see that even in the most blue villages, blue being the party color of the right-wing AfD, they noticed a shift in attitudes, and they noticed a lot of enthusiasm to help Ukrainian war refugees, which was definitely not there when refugees from other regions came. And I also attended a session at a conference in Strasbourg where there was a panel on it was a social economy conference or innovative economy conference, and the session was basically about entrepreneurs from different European contexts uniting to think about how to help Ukraine. And there was a Black lady there from France, and she very politely reminded the audience that, of course, the war in Ukraine is not the only war going on worldwide. I suppose she made aware that there is also this hierarchy. And a second point that is, I guess, also only partially touched are different interests. I mean, this quote, a stock of human capital to maintain and mobilize, sheds a certain light on why Ukrainian war refugees are welcome in Europe or in the EU. But of course, the Ukrainian state has a very different attitude. We had a short discussion, which was not so much in the media, on school curricula. How should Ukrainian kids be taught in Germany? And in that sense, I think it's necessary to acknowledge that I'm just looking, to acknowledge the very difficult demographic situation of Ukraine. One British colleague called Ukraine the most demographically damaged state in Europe. And I think this is very true if you look at very low birth rates, abysmal life expectancy, very strong shrinkage, and a very poor natural balance. So I guess that's the population geographer speaking, and I think I can side with Agnes here and finish on a rather negative point, and hope that in the second round of discussion we can talk a bit more about the positive aspects.
Thank you so much, Tim. On the second round of questions, I mean, this kind of larger question is not so specific, so it gives you a lot of space to discuss. And now I'm already happy to know that you have something optimistic waiting for us. But it is about your outlook on your research and also on research in your respective fields, and how might it be changing, or how you want to see it changing in coming months and years, right? I think Volodymyr already gave preliminary thoughts about this. So actually, perhaps, Agli, we start with you and then with Tim, and then Volodymyr can reflect later after you, if that's fine.
Okay. So in terms of these efforts that I was speaking about for Eastern European knowledge production that could be directly relevant to local social struggles too. Looking from the present moment, there are several aspects that stand out. I will just mention some generic ones and then dwell a bit on a specific one. So among the generic ones, there is this issue that they seem, what we've been doing from the current perspective in terms of its conceptualization is a bit backward looking. In terms of being focused on earlier, more stable and structured moments of the same global crisis or long downturn, as Robert Brenner called it, like things like financialization, neoliberalization, the related geographic fixes of production networks. I mean, these are things that have been going on since the 70s. Another similar moment is that the conceptualization of the socialist, post-socialist idea, it has been mapped on this heritage of East-West binary of the Cold War situation, where the East is defined as the Soviet Union and then Russia, and the parallel, or not even so parallel, story of what happened in China, this gigantic and extremely influential transformation, has been less part of trying to conceptualize our post-socialist condition, and at the present moment it is already so intensively acting already within the region, and the conceptualization is lagging behind. I mean, it even happened here in the second keynote, this question that, okay, what is the situation in Eastern Europe now? Okay, but what is China? And a third similar aspect is the structural or more stable nature of the phenomena that we are speaking about, that is sort of presupposed in these ways of conceptualization, but which you cannot count on anymore. So in other words, the level of disruptions that we are facing now and that we will be probably facing even more in the near future is just not factored in these conceptual frameworks. In terms of what the first keynote spoke about, this production chain disruptions, but also in terms of what we see now as militarized conflict, and then how these disruptions themselves become shaping factors of even structural powers, like this immense wave of state investments into arms production that we are seeing now sitting in Eastern Europe, where one of the main places where these geopolitical tensions play out. It's really not a very encouraging situation, and it's something that has to be dealt with. And then in terms of ways forward, it's a very large space of discussion, as Leila mentioned. That the aspect that I wanted to tease out is just one of them, and it has to do with these efforts that we in this broader East European network have been doing. And here I would think that we need to keep doing what we were doing earlier, but with a more intensive focus on building partnerships that make it possible to focus on the interconnected social aspects of the transnational processes that are shaping the region within this turmoil. So this is exactly sort of opposite to this geopolitical reification bid that we are facing, to keep it social and keep it transnational, the perspective. And what I mean by how the critical angle, the political engagement and the organizational grounding that makes this focus possible to maintain, how they are connected, I would just bring two examples. And one of the examples is Volodymyr and other colleagues working from post-Soviet countries, including Russia. It is a collaboration that I am not part of. I don't know about these places, but I learned a lot from it, and it's very inspiring from this perspective. The work on post-Soviet revolutions, what was the effort to conceptualize what was the post-Soviet situation, and within it the Russian form of hegemony in the post-Soviet era, and how is it crumbling now as part of the intensification of the global crisis? What we saw as revolutions in Belarus, in Armenia, in Kazakhstan, in the Maidan case, within that, and how the after effects and escalation of the conflicts that follow this, what is the significance of this in terms of us understanding what is happening globally, not only understanding what is happening in Ukraine. And for instance, in this case, you just cannot separate the ambition and the significance of this kind of conceptualization and empirical research effort from the concrete collaboration that has been going on for years before the war and also after the war between scholars who are situated also in Ukraine and also in Russia and other places. So just the collective social fact of the partnership is so essential to the angle and to the knowledge that you can produce and its potential relevance that it's impossible to separate these. And the other example I want to bring is more close to what I have been doing and maybe hope to join in collective efforts later, is about places like Hungary or Serbia, which are now discussed so much in these terms of why they are choosing East versus West or something. The angle that I would think of would be more about how these kind of places are now becoming these places very intensively penetrated by a transformation of global production networks and related financial investment as part of capitalist fixes from both Eastern and Western capital, and as part of this new wave of securitization of production chains, where you are using states to somehow try to keep these chains secure in the middle of a process that is bringing more and more disruptions. And how this relates to the increasing geopolitical tensions and instability that are also threatening these new constructs that are happening locally, and how this relates to the authoritarian nature of these regimes, which contrary to these binaries of East versus West, democracy versus authoritarianism, if you look at what is happening in terms of production and labor regimes, it is the thing that makes it even possible and guaranteed that these investment flows can even happen in these places. So I'm speaking about things like this new increasingly intensively toxic lithium mine investment by Australian company Rio Tinto in Serbia, new increasing intensively toxic investment by Chinese car tire manufacturer Linglong in Serbia, which was conditioned by such a deep transformation of the Serbian labor law that allows workers there to be exempted from under Serbian labor regulation. How this is connected to the BRI project of the Budapest-Belgrade Railway, how this is connected to this car-making value chain dominated by the German car manufacturers who are investing in Hungary, going there for the cheaper labor force, and the increasing Eastern investments into accumulator factories in Hungary. So all these products being built into the German cars through this network, and the labor flows and these cascading hierarchies of migrant labor that is happening in the same factories, which by now isn't even about Hungarians going to German factories and Ukrainians coming to Hungarian factories. It's about these packaged, intermediated deals through which Filipino, Korean, Vietnamese, Indian workers are being brought to these huge new factories that are built as we are speaking. So if you want to address this from a social perspective of what is happening in the region, you need to build the partnerships that make you able to follow these channels. And it is a different kind of work than looking at top political communication of geopolitical choices.
Okay. I guess from my perspective as a population geographer and migration researcher, I would focus on a few research questions or research topics I think could be interesting and relevant in the next months and years to come. And I guess the positive and I guess very interesting point I would like to start with is that like during the pandemic, we see some kind of social science knowledge production in real time. So if you search for the migration-related consequences of Russia's war on Ukraine and in the invasion, you can see a lot of very interesting papers and also a lot of methodological innovation on how to deal with limited data availability and things changing all the time. So I guess that's also a good proof that also as social scientists, we are very up to date and very innovative when it comes to dealing with difficult situations on every level. So I guess what future research could bring is certainly research on the hierarchies of migrants that I already mentioned on different levels. Narratives in the press, reactions of civil society, mobilization of civil society. One point that Dorothee mentioned yesterday, the exit voice and the selective migration, brain drain from Russia. I guess we also see brain drain from a lot of other countries, which turns into brain waste in many places of the global north, when people cannot capitalize on their education, but work in jobs which are way below what they are trained for. Another aspect that I guess is also increasingly relevant is to use migration as a weapon. That is, I suppose, best symbolized by Belarus's attempt to open its borders to the EU to let in the migrants from the Middle East. Of course, what demographic and regional development or demographical and regional development consequences will the war have on Ukraine, on Russia, on the EU? These are certainly all very relevant questions that we will be working on in the future. And I guess I would finish with a short advertisement jingle concerning doing research, the ethical and practical questions of doing research in Ukraine, in Belarus, in Russia, in other authoritarian contexts, in other war-torn contexts, in other contexts affected by violence and war and conflict. We will have the 8th version of the IFL research workshop dedicated to this very topic on March the 23rd and 24th, 2023 at IFL and online. And we will discuss questions like how to protect informants and interview partners, how to deal with trauma that especially qualitative research could uncover both in informants and researchers, which is, I guess, a challenge to training at universities, especially in geography. How to deal with misinformation, how to deal with propaganda, but also how could picking sides and closing doors affect scientists' careers, and many other questions. The call will be sent through the usual channels frequently, and maybe we can see a few of you at the IFL research workshop on the topic of doing research in conflict zones and in authoritarian under authoritarian conditions. Sorry.
Does anyone else hear something like a cartoon being played? Right? Is it It's actually children playing. Okay. Marvelous to know. I was like, is there something? Okay. Volodymyr, maybe you try to make it fast so that we can have
really.
time for questions, and I encourage everybody to prepare questions in the meantime because we will be opening for it soon.
Yeah, really, thank you. I really believe that I've already outlined how I see the problems of the knowledge production of the Ukraine, at least from the Ukrainian side, and where I see the prospective developments. So basically, to put it in a few words, I'm worried about the resurrection of quite outdated theories of some like teleological nation building modernization narrative, which is very much now reproduced about Ukraine, that could start from not simply like from 2014, but from 1991, from 1917, from 17th century. And put it into linear development where the Russian invasion is finally the culmination and the Ukrainian nation is standing against them and would finally establish ourselves as the proper Western modernized nation state. And there is also like Western teleological story, democracy against dictatorship. And there is also a Russian teleological story about the resurrection of the great power. And of course, it's understandable why during the times of war, we get this teleological, very much class blind and diversity blind stories because the political leaders need to mobilize the population in order to fight the war. They need the goal. They don't need to discuss any internal conflicts, diversities. However, it's not exactly the theories that help us to understand what's happening and how to prevent it to happen once again. And my proposals to how to do it differently, to do it better, were precisely about taking the rejecting teleology, but taking the crisis condition very seriously and trying to understand, based on the Ukraine, but also on the wider post-Soviet context, the dynamics of political crisis that probably the many societies in the world have been experiencing since the 1970s, and how the political processes that inspire many people and should have been pushing to the what is the perceived as solutions to the crisis, like the revolutions that are repeating and accelerating. And the reason that's why they are happening so frequently and at accelerating tempo in the post-Soviet space is precisely because they, when they try to respond to the political crisis, they reproduce the very crisis in its own development, and then more so, they escalate the very crisis. And that's how the revolutions that have been widely perceived as non-violent, as pushing to democratization, in effect, they push to something completely the opposite. And with a big contrast, for example, to the revolutions of the past. And there are also the conservative responses to the crisis, which are also simply preserve, kind of like provide temporary stabilization of the situation, like Putin's regime, Lukashenko's regime in Belarus. However, they happen to be also fragile. And after some 5 or 6 re-elections, Lukashenko is meeting a massive uprising that nobody expected, or the uprising in Kazakhstan this year that again, quite a few people would expect after 35 years of Nazarbayev's rule. So, and these are not provincial stories, it's just stories that could actually help us to understand the context of the populist movements in the West, in the global South, the appearance of the regimes like Viktor Orban's, Donald Trump's, that there are even very specific connections between, let's say, Ukraine via Paul Manafort, who was an advisor to Viktor Yanukovych, overthrown in 2014, and the same person who was advising Donald Trump, and that's how like a part of the story about Russiagate was constructed. So transnational connections, but also let's take our countries much more seriously that it has been they've been taken before, and we actually can learn from them, not just simply as another weird strange case existing somewhere in some great zone where not so many people were paying the attention to, but actually probably a part of the core, a part of the most essential spot and place where the dynamics of the crisis could be seen perhaps in the sharpest and the most tragic forms. And let's learn from this.
Are the questions already out there? Daniela, up.
Yes, thank you very much to the panelists. I'm sorry I was late. I wanted to comment on the first presentation. I missed part of it, but I disagree with many points. I want to illustrate only one of them, and it is about Maidan and development of civil society in Ukraine, which it seems to be kind of, it was said something very fast, but I think that this is a very important point. And I am looking at this as a research of gender. I'm coming from gender studies. I think that with respect to women's rights, LGBT people rights, there were very important developments in Ukraine. Of course, comparing with Russia, it will be a very big difference. And it is connected with the possibilities of civil society kind of forming new NGOs, starting new gender studies programs, educating children, like doing different kind of work at school, and so on. I know it because of my cooperation with Ukrainian colleagues. We were just cooperating, publishing together. I am a Russian. I live in Sweden for 20 years, working and living in Sweden. And so during all this period, I was publishing together with Ukrainian colleagues on issues on women's rights, queer rights, and so on. And so I think that if we look from the gender studies perspective, development of gender knowledge, so we will see really that Maidan was a starting point for cooperation between civil society organizations, feminist organizations, queer rights organizations, and gender research. And from this perspective, it will be seen much more positively, the development, and you just did not mention it. So thank you.
Thank you. I saw there was one more hand up. We can take another comment. We can even take one more, I would say, if there is. Nadir. Yes.
Thank you. Thanks a lot for all of your contributions. I learned a lot. I saw an interesting, inspiring maybe tension in my view in the presentations of Agnes and Vladimir, and I'd be curious to know what you about my way of making sense of it. So Vladimir, I agree, and I think with the points you made on the risks of tokenism, of formalist representation, on the risk that there are structural biases in who will be heard as Ukrainian voices in the West, and that this may even be a certain fix of a hegemony crisis in the West. And I think these are important points which are often not voiced. At the same time, I see some risks there's also a trend of bashing identity politics across the political spectrum and also in different realms. And my worry is a bit that this argument is often used in order to delegitimize perspectives and voices which are marginalized anyhow. And I was wondering a bit if the important points that you made, Agnes, on that what matters is probably less these identity categories, but a level of engagement and of familiarity with context and so on is another way of looking at what actually bringing, for instance, Ukrainian voices or whatever voices these may be into the discussion. Because if one of the problems is really that they are instrumentalized at the moment in Western public, say, then I guess ignoring Ukrainian voices at this moment isn't a great idea to continue. But it must be about adding complexity in bringing in more voices and more of these complexity via deep engagement with the context, and probably not only by scholars, but only by people who are involved in actual struggles on the ground. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll take one more comment and then ask the panelists to respond. Nadir?
Yeah, thanks a lot for very interesting, inspiring presentations. I'm no expert on Ukraine, but my question is more towards the knowledge production area. So we are constantly told that dichotomies are no good because we cannot capture diversity and hybridity. True, there are many countries that are hybrid, and dichotomy doesn't help to explain process in China or where that state capitalism is prominent. But how else to explain a military aggression of an authoritarian state against a democracy, although imperfect, without a dichotomy of democracy versus authoritarianism? I guess without all good categories of political science, we cannot solve that question. Thank you.
I'm sorry. Is it okay because we need to close up as long as they're short?
Very shortly, in the same line of argumentation, and namely, labor is not the only way of explanatory model. We're speaking also rules of law, corruption. We inherited in Eastern Europe multiple corrupted elites back from the socialist period, and then it continued for the last 30 years. So this is not the only prism. That's it. Thank you.
I very much wish I could also respond to some of the questions, but I'll let you respond. Who wants to go first? Tim? No?
Okay, yeah. I believe most of the questions were to me. I'll try to address them at least briefly. Yes, feminist civil society. Yes, it has been empowered. The question is how much of Ukrainian women, these feminist, middle class, pro-Western, Western-supported civil societies actually representing. And there have been some very ridiculous cases, but the agenda of feminist civil society in Ukraine is kind of like, it is important, yes, but it's also blind on some of the issues that are of the primary importance for Ukrainian women and which are social economic issues. So this, and it's not simply a Ukrainian case. Again, speaking about globalizing discussion of the Ukraine, Mark Basinger, American political scientist, published a book this year called Revolutionary City, where he made a statistical quantitative analysis of the revolutionary incidents since the start of the 20th century, and where he conceptualized the phenomenon of so-called urban civic revolutions, something what I would, for example, call Maidan revolutions. And statistically, he shows that this kind of revolutions, even if they proclaim to be the revolutions for democracy, they end up only as revolutions against dictatorships. They do not bring more social equality. They do not even bring more gender equality. However, what they do, they empower middle-class civil societies for a certain period, and in which period they acquire more political opportunities to pursue their agendas. The question is, if we're taking seriously the crisis put representation, to which extent the self-acclaimed representatives or wider groups actually represent them. And that's to the question of Alexander. of course, like it's not exactly about just bashing identity politics, but simply asking ourselves what else we actually need beyond the identity politics. Yeah, of course, identities are kind of like a part of the social reality, and people amplify and they refer to their identities, and identities are used in the political struggle, and that's just life. Yes, but that's what's more. We also understand all the problems with the identity politics, and we should take some efforts in order to address those problems. And it should not be simply to add another voice. Let's say we are not satisfied with middle-class Ukrainians speaking Ukrainians from Kiev and Western region. So let's add some Ukrainians from Donbass, from Odessa, from Kharkov, from East and Southern, and we'll get more Ukrainian voices. I mean, the point is not simply to add up letters, but to qualitatively restructure the discussion of Ukraine, not simply to listen more people, but to starting from Ukraine to go into more global, into more generally relevant questions. And I believe that would be more productive. And let's start thinking about that. And democracy versus dictatorship. I mean, when you even started to ask this question, I would ask us: Is it really the democracy against dictatorship war? Is it something about something else? Because even asking this question, you frame it, and then you end up, yes. So how should we call the war of democracy against dictatorship, or dictatorship against democracy? I'm not sure that's at least that's all of the story which is going on between Ukraine and Russia, and it's also the story of imperialism. It's also the story of nationalism. It's also the story of the Soviet crisis, which I'm particularly very much invested in studying that. So, I mean, the concepts that the political leaders are sending to the public sphere are quite often not exactly the best concepts that we should, as scientists, use in order to do our own job. They do their job, and that's understandable. But we have our own job to do.
Vladimir, Agi, we are almost done, but I think you should also get a word to respond. Wait, no, this is not working. Just
okay. So from the identity politics question, sorry if I simplify it for rhetorical reasons, but the way I take it is that if there's a problem with tokenizing Ukrainians in discussions about the war, then how do we interpret this statement that East Europeans didn't and still don't have enough space for discussing directly their own conditions? Then shouldn't you still include them somehow based on the fact that they are East Europeans? And to this, I would like to say that this general perspective, I mean, to bring it back to one of the most influential and clear explanations of what this would mean from a really decolonial perspective in Frantz Fanon, who is explaining that you are Black, you identified as Black. Your problem is that this identification of Black against white. How you're going to solve this problem? You cannot, and this was his conclusion, you cannot solve this on the symbolic identity level of Black versus white, because the hierarchy that this identification implies is not in the concept. The concept is the product of the real social domination that happens in the colonial structure. So your chance to emancipate yourself as a Black person to the level of more universal human potential that you could be as a human is not on the level of dealing with the identity stems themselves, but basically it's in the anti-colonial struggle. And when we speak about trying to produce an Eastern European knowledge collaboration that is directly relevant to, human emancipation in Eastern Europe and is relevant to the global conversation about this, it is this level that we try to emphasize. And then coming back to the other question about, yes, but a war is definitely a binary thing. One country attacks the other. If you're a soldier or a citizen of any of them, you're going to be treated accordingly. You cannot act outside of those determinations. So how on earth this is not binary? What does labor has to do with this? Labor doesn't explain spheres of interest, war interests, and so on. Yes, but what I think we were trying to address was that labor's position in this is basically a majority position. Most of us are that. We are subjected to these processes, and the way these processes produce their own conceptualizations based on the war-based duality erases the perspective of all these people who are subjected to these processes, not only the war, but also pre-war humiliation as the industrialized labor, pre-war humiliation as reindustrialized labor, as migrant labor, as surrogate mothers, as care work, as labor being subjected to war-based new labor regulation, which is basically taking away all the labor rights, to these new authoritarianisms that are enabled further by the war, the life forms that are being killed in the war. If you say that labor is irrelevant to the war and you're not allowed to speak to the question of the war from this perspective, then actually who you are with, it's in the real life that applies to us as labor. It is not the countries that are involved in this, but it is a much more complex sphere of factors where there is a complete difference in between whose political project and power project this is, whose capital investment project this is, and for whom I am expected to die in a trench.
I think we can safely close it here. Thanks from my end once more. And thanks for your patience. I think in the end, we still went slightly over time, but not terribly.